If you wake up in the dead of night and hear a rhythmic tapping coming from inside your bedroom wall, your mind immediately tries to rationalize it. You tell yourself it is just settling pipes, or maybe a raccoon that found its way into the attic, or if you are feeling particularly paranoid, maybe you think it is a ghost. But you never ever assume that the scratching sound behind the drywall is actually another human being. A living, breathing person sitting in the pitch black, just inches from your face, listening to you sleep. What happened to this poor family in the late 1980s is quite literally one of the most terrifying things I have ever heard, because it proves that the monsters we are so afraid of in the dark do not always stay in the shadows. Sometimes they live in your house. This is the story of the boy in the walls. But before we get into that, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you have come to the right place, because that is all we do here. If that sounds like something you would enjoy, please sneak into the like button house, replace all of its regular coffee with decaf, and then gently, firmly press subscribe and turn on all notifications so you do not miss our weekly uploads. Alright, let us get into the story. The town of Pepperell, Massachusetts, in the late 1980s was the kind of place where nothing truly bad ever happened. It is one of those classic, sleepy New England towns surrounded by dense forests, winding country roads, and old wooden houses that have been standing for generations. It was the kind of community where neighbors knew each other by their first names, kids rode their bikes until the streetlights came on, and people rarely bothered to lock their front doors at night. There was a profound sense of safety there, a bubble of quiet suburban life that felt entirely insulated from the violent crime you would see on the evening news happening in big cities. Living in one of these older, charming homes was a man named Frank Bowen and his two teenage daughters, Tina, who was 16 years old, and Kari, who was just slightly younger. From the outside looking in, the Bowens seemed like your typical hardworking American family. Frank was a blue-collar guy, an incredibly dedicated father who worked long, grueling hours to provide for his girls. He was the kind of dad who showed his love through provision, leaving the house before the sun came up and coming home exhausted, just trying to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. He was the anchor of the family, strong and dependable. But inside the house, behind closed doors, the atmosphere was suffocatingly heavy. The Bowen family was living in the immediate crushing aftermath of a devastating loss. Just a short time before the events of this story take place, Frank's wife, the girl's mother, had passed away. Her sudden death had violently ripped the heart out of their home, leaving behind a massive void that none of them knew how to fill. When you lose someone that's central to your family, the house itself changes. The physical space actually feels different. A home that used to be filled with laughter, the clattering of dishes in the kitchen, the smell of dinner cooking, and the warm hum of daily life suddenly becomes agonizingly quiet. For Tina and Carrie, the silence was the absolute hardest part. Every empty room they walked into, every vacant chair at the dining room table, every echoing footstep in the long upstairs hallway was a constant, glaring reminder that their mother was gone forever. They would often leave the television running in the living room all day, not because they were watching it, but just to create some background noise to drown out the deafening silence of their grief. Because Frank had to work such incredibly long shifts to keep the family afloat financially and pay off medical bills, he was absent for large portions of the day and well into the evening. This meant that Tina and Kari were very often left completely alone in this big, quiet, grieving house. Tina, bravely stepping into the role of the older sister, did her absolute best to take care of young Kari. She would cook the dinners, help her sister with her homework, make sure the doors were locked, and try to maintain some fragile semblance of normalcy. But at the end of the day, they were just kids They were incredibly vulnerable, entirely consumed by their sorrow, and desperately yearning for just one more conversation with their mom. Grief has a very strange way of altering your perception of reality. When you are hurting that badly, your mind actively looks for comfort in places it normally would not. You start looking for signs. A sudden gust of wind that rattles the window, a flickering light bulb in the hallway, a misplaced hairbrush on the bathroom counter. You want so badly to believe that it is your loved one reaching out from the other side just to tell you that they are okay and that they are still watching over you. This desperate hope, this innocent yearning for a spiritual connection, is exactly what laid the groundwork for the nightmare that was about to unfold. You see, the Bowen house was quite old. Like many houses in New England built decades prior, it had a very specific quirky architecture. It had thick plaster walls, drafty wooden window frames, creaking hardwood floors, and, crucially, a vast network of hidden crawl spaces. These narrow, dark gaps between the inner walls and the outer frame were originally designed for insulation, plumbing access, and electrical wiring. They were dusty, unlit, and entirely forgotten by the people living inside. Nobody ever thought about the crawl spaces. Why would you? They were completely sealed off from the living areas, accessible only through obscure utility panels hidden in the backs of closets or forgotten attic hatches covered in years of dust. As the long, bitter Massachusetts winter began to set in, the days grew much shorter and the nights grew darker, colder, and more isolating. The freezing wind would howl off the surrounding woods, battering the sides of the old wooden house, causing the entire structural frame to groan and settle under the pressure. The old heating pipes would clank loudly, and the floorboards would pop sharply as the temperature dropped below freezing. In an old house during a harsh winter, random, spooky noises are simply a fact of daily life. You learn to tune them out. You tell yourself it is just the house breathing. You tell yourself there is nothing to be afraid of. But as the deep winter rolled around, the noises inside the Bowen house started to change. They were no longer the random, chaotic sounds of a settling foundation or expanding metal pipes. They began to take on a strange, deliberate, and almost intelligent rhythm. It started incredibly subtly, so subtly that neither Tina nor Kari even bothered to mention it to each other at first, not wanting to sound crazy. Tina would be sitting alone in her bedroom late at night doing her homework, wrapped tightly in a thick blanket to fend off the winter chill leaking through the window pane. The house would be pitch black except for the small circle of yellow light from her desk lamp. Suddenly, over the howling of the wind outside, she would hear a faint scratching sound. Just a brief, quiet scuffing noise, like a fingernail dragging slowly against the raw wood, coming from directly behind the plaster of her bedroom wall. She would freeze, her pencil hovering over her paper, and hold her breath, straining to listen. But the house would just fall dead silent again. Her heart would pound in her chest for a few seconds, but she would quickly shake her head, assuming it was just a dead tree branch scraping against the exterior siding outside, and force herself to go back to her math textbook. A few days later, Kari was sitting on the rug, watching television in the living room, while Tina was in the kitchen preparing dinner. The house was quiet except for the muffled voices of the cartoon on the screen. Out of nowhere, Kari heard what sounded distinctly like a soft, heavy footstep directly above her head, coming from the ceiling of the first floor. It was not the light, frantic scurry of a mouse or a squirrel. It was the slow, deliberate pressure of a significant amount of weight being shifted onto a wooden beam. She immediately grabbed the remote and muted the television, staring wide-eyed up at the white plaster ceiling, her heart beating frantically against her ribs. She waited for another sound. She waited for a voice. But after 30 long seconds of absolute, terrifying stillness, she let out a breath and convinced herself it was just her imagination playing tricks on her in the big, empty house. They were rationalizing everything, brushing off every bizarre occurrence, just like any normal person would do. Because the alternative was simply too terrifying to even let into their minds. But the old house was waking up, and the heavy, grieving silence of the Bowen family was about to be shattered by something far worse than any ghost. As the long weeks dragged on, the subtle, easily dismissed noises inside the Bowen house began to evolve. It was no longer just a random scuff against the drywall or a heavy thud on the ceiling that you could blindly blame on the harsh Massachusetts winter. The strange occurrences started bleeding out of the walls and into the physical space of the home itself. It started with incredibly mundane things, the kind of things that make you question your own sanity rather than suspect anything genuinely sinister. Tina would come home from high school, unlock the heavy wooden front door, and drop her house keys on the small table in the entryway, exactly where she left them every single day. She would walk into the kitchen to grab a glass of water, and when she walked back out to the hallway just a few minutes later, the keys would be completely gone. She would spend 20 frantic minutes tearing the living room apart, only to find the keys sitting perfectly centered on her bedroom pillow upstairs. She would just shake her head, assuming her immense grief was making her absent-minded, telling herself she must have carried them upstairs without even realizing it. But soon the anomalies became absolutely impossible to ignore. The girls would be sitting on the living room rug doing their homework, with the television tuned to a local station just to fill the agonizing silence of the house. Suddenly the channel would flip. It was not a burst of static from a bad antenna, but a loud, deliberate click to a completely different station. The heavy physical dial on the old television set had actually been turned. They would freeze, stare at the screen, and then look around the empty room. Carrie would ask if Tina had touched it, but Tina was sitting 5 feet away, her hands frozen over her notebook. Things in the kitchen started shifting on their own. A carton of milk left on the counter would suddenly be back inside the refrigerator when they turned around. A half-eaten sandwich left on a plate would disappear entirely when Tina walked into the dining room to grab a napkin. At first, the sisters genuinely thought they were just playing tricks on each other, maybe trying to pull some sort of misguided prank to lighten the suffocating, depressing mood in the house. But the looks of genuine, wide-eyed confusion and rising panic on each other's faces quickly shut down that theory. When Frank came home late from work, his hands calloused and his eyes heavy with absolute exhaustion, the girls would nervously corner him in the kitchen and bring up these bizarre events. They would sit him down and tell him about the moving keys, the television changing channels on its own, the disappearing food, and the phantom footsteps they kept hearing on the second floor. Frank, being a deeply pragmatic, blue-collar father who was already dealing with an unimaginable burden of grief and financial stress, reacted the way almost any logical parent in his situation would. He rationalized it. He sat his daughters down and told them that old New England houses have notoriously faulty wiring, which easily explained the television acting up. He gently reminded them that severe trauma and grief can do terrible, confusing things to your memory, making you forget where you placed your keys or whether you actually put the milk away. Trying to make them feel safe, he would dutifully get up, walk around the entire first floor, physically check the deadbolts on the front and back doors, and show them that everything was completely secure. He would pull the heavy curtains back, pointing out the freezing winter storm raging outside, and assure them that nobody could possibly be getting inside their home. It was just the wind, the old foundation settling, and their exhausted, grieving minds playing tricks on them. He hugged his daughters tight, told them there was absolutely nothing to be afraid of, and went upstairs to get whatever few hours of sleep he could before his next grueling shift. Frank logic was completely sound. The doors were always locked from the inside. The heavy wooden windows were painted shut or frozen over. There were absolutely no signs of forced entry anywhere on the property. Physically speaking, no one was breaking into their home, but the girls knew exactly what they were experiencing. They knew they were not going crazy, and when logic completely fails to explain the impossible, the human mind instinctively turns to the supernatural. This is exactly where the story takes a deeply tragic and psychological turn. Because Tina and Kari did not have a rational physical explanation for the moving objects and the shifting sounds, and because they were so incredibly desperate for any kind of comfort after losing their mother, they reached a heartbreaking conclusion. They decided that the invisible presence in their home was not a threat at all. They decided it was their mom. They convinced themselves that her spirit had not fully moved on, that she was trapped somewhere between this world and the next, and that she was using the television, the objects in the kitchen, and the noises in the walls to try and communicate with them. She was just trying to say she was still there and that she was still looking after her little girls. This singular, devastating misunderstanding changed the entire dynamic of the household. Instead of being utterly terrified of the strange noises in the house, the girls began to welcome them. When the floorboards creaked heavily in the empty hallway upstairs, they no longer locked their bedroom doors in pure terror. Instead, they would walk out into the dark hallway and call out softly into the shadows, saying hello, asking if she was there. When an object went missing from the kitchen counter, they would gently ask the empty room to please give it back, smiling a sad, hopeful smile when it mysteriously reappeared in a different room hours later. They were leaning completely into the haunting. They were willingly lowering every single physical and psychological defense they had left. They stopped feeling paranoid and started feeling a twisted, tragic sense of comfort. They truly thought they were building a bridge to the afterlife to reach the mother they missed so desperately. They would talk out loud to the empty rooms, sharing secrets about their day at school, talking about boys they liked, and crying about how much they missed her. They had absolutely no idea that every single word they whispered into the dark was actually being carefully listened to. The girls thought they were finding peace, but they were actually inviting something incredibly dark right into the center of their lives, setting the stage for a confrontation that would shatter their reality forever. Because the girls believed that their deceased mother was the one moving the keys and changing the television channels, they fundamentally changed how they interacted with the empty house. But passive movement of objects is one thing. Active direct communication is an entirely different level of terrifying. And that is exactly what happened next. It was the dead of winter, during a particularly brutal cold snap. Frank was working a grueling night shift, so it was just Tina and Kari alone in the house. Tina was lying in her bed, staring up at the dark ceiling. Her bed was pushed up flush against the interior wall of her bedroom. On the other side of that half-inch of drywall was one of those dark, unfinished crawl spaces we talked about earlier, completely hidden from the rest of the house. The house was incredibly quiet, save for the occasional howling of the wind outside. And then, cutting right through the heavy silence, Tina heard a sound coming from right next to her head. It was a knock, but it was not the dull, hollow thud of wood settling or a pipe expanding. It was sharp, deliberate tap, tap, tap. She froze completely. Her blood ran cold. The sound was so distinct. It sounded exactly like human knuckles rapping lightly against the inside of the plaster wall. Just inches from her pillow, Tina slowly sat up in bed, pulling the heavy comforter up to her chin. Normally, under any other circumstances, a teenager would run screaming out of the house into the freezing snow. But remember the psychological blind spot the girls had built. Tina took a deep, trembling breath, leaned slightly closer to the cold wall, and whispered out into the dark bedroom, asking if her mom was there. Absolute silence. So, with her heart pounding out of her chest, Tina raised her own right hand, curled it into a fist, and gently knocked twice on the drywall. Tap, tap, she waited. 5 long seconds passed. Then 10. She was just about to lie back down, desperately trying to convince herself she was being silly and imagining things, when the wall directly beside her head knocked back. Tap, tap. It was an immediate, intelligent response. Whatever was inside that house was not just randomly moving things around anymore. It was actively listening to her, and it was answering. Tina immediately jumped out of bed, sprinted down the dark hallway, and brought her younger sister Kari back into the room with her. The two girls sat cross-legged on the mattress, staring at the blank, off-white plaster wall as if it were a living, breathing person. They began to experiment. They would knock 3 times. And a few seconds later, 3 distinct knocks would echo back from the dark void inside the architecture of the house. They started asking basic questions out loud, establishing a rudimentary system of communication. 1 knock meant yes, 2 knocks meant no. They asked things like, "Are you happy?" and "Are you watching over us?" The answering knocks would always come from the exact same spot in the wall, perfectly level with where an adult would be sitting if they were directly on the other side of the drywall. For a very short period of time, this bizarre, deeply unsettling nightly ritual actually brought the grieving girls an overwhelming sense of peace. They genuinely felt like they had successfully bridged the gap between the living and the dead to reach the mother they missed so much. But that fragile feeling of comfort did not last long at all. Very quickly, the energy surrounding these late-night tapping sessions began to dramatically shift. It stopped feeling like a warm, loving mother reaching out to comfort her sad children. It started feeling incredibly heavy, oppressive, intrusive. Sometimes, late at night, long after the girls had stopped asking questions and tried to go to sleep, the noises from the wall would continue completely unprompted. Tina would lie perfectly still in the dark, her back pressed hard against the mattress, listening to a slow, methodical scraping sound dragging along the inside of her bedroom wall. It sounded exactly like fingernails slowly dragging down the raw wooden studs, tracing the entire perimeter of a room in the pitch black. Worse than the scraping, though, was the breathing. On particularly quiet nights, when the winter wind died down and the house was absolutely completely silent, Tina would lay with her head near the wall and hear a very faint, raspy sound bleeding through the plaster. It was not the wind whistling through a crack in the window frame. It was the distinct rhythmic sound of heavy, congested human breathing. In and out, in and out. It sounded exactly like someone was pressing their face directly against the other side of the wall, just listening to her breathe in her bed. The girls began to feel constantly watched. The innocent, naive comfort they had found in the ghost of their mother was rapidly being replaced by a suffocating, paralyzing paranoia. They started sleeping in the same bed together, keeping all the hallway lights on, terrified of whatever was lurking just behind that thin veil of paint and plaster. Because whatever was answering their knocks, whatever was breathing so heavily in the dark, did not feel like their mother anymore. It felt incredibly angry, and it felt predatory. The girls realized they needed a much clearer way to communicate with whatever was trapped in their house to find out what it truly wanted from them, which led them to make a fateful decision that would escalate the horror to an absolute breaking point. They decided to bring a Ouija board into the house. Desperate for answers and utterly terrified of the aggressive new sounds coming from the walls of their home, Tina and Kari resorted to something that teenagers have used at sleepovers for decades, but usually just as a harmless joke. They decided to use a Ouija board. They needed to know for sure who or what they were talking to. They waited for a night when a massive winter storm was hammering the Massachusetts coast, knowing their father Frank would be delayed at work, and they would have the house entirely to themselves for hours. They turned off the main overhead lights in the living room, leaving only a single dim floor lamp burning in the corner, casting long, distorted shadows across the faded wallpaper. The two sisters sat cross-legged on the living room rug, surrounded by the heavy, suffocating silence of the old house, with the howling wind rattling the window panes outside. They placed the cardboard board on their knees and lightly rested their trembling fingertips on the plastic planchette. Tina took a deep breath, looked nervously around the empty, shadowy room, and called out softly, asking if their mother was present. For a long time, nothing happened. The house remained dead quiet. The girls just stared at the board, their fingers starting to cramp from holding so still. But then, very slowly, they felt a strange magnetic pull. The plastic planchette began to glide across the cardboard surface. Both girls immediately snapped their heads up, looking at each other, accusing the other of pushing it. But both swore on their lives they were not doing it. The plastic piece moved in a slow, deliberate figure-8 pattern before coming to rest firmly on the word yes. They felt a massive wave of relief wash over them, tears springing to their eyes, thinking they had finally made a direct, undeniable connection with their mom. But that warm feeling of relief evaporated almost instantly. Tina asked another question. She asked, "Are you happy where you are?" The planchette did not slide smoothly this time. It jerked aggressively under their fingers. It moved with a frantic, angry, jagged energy, darting violently across the letters to spell out a single word. No, Tina swallowed hard, her heart starting to beat a little faster against her ribs. She tried to keep her voice steady and asked, "Why are you upset?" The planchette darted across the board again, spelling out a phrase that made their blood run completely cold. It spelled out, "I am not her." The temperature in the living room seemed to instantly plummet. The girls were physically shaking, but they were entirely too terrified to take their hands off the board, remembering the old urban legend that breaking contact without saying goodbye would trap an evil spirit in the house forever. Kari, crying silently now, whispered into the dark room, "Then who are you?" The planchette moved again, but this time it did not give a name. Instead, it started spelling out horrible, violent, and deeply personal things. It spelled out that it was watching them right now. It spelled out exactly what color sweater Kari was wearing at that very moment. It perfectly described the layout of their upstairs bedroom. It told them that it liked watching them sleep, and it told them it was never, ever going to leave. The girls screamed, ripped their hands away from the board, and scrambled backward away from it, sobbing in absolute terror. The comforting illusion they had built was completely shattered. This was not the loving, protective spirit of their mother watching over them. In their minds, they had accidentally invited a dark, malevolent demon right into the center of their home. A violent poltergeist that had attached itself to their grief and was now actively hunting them. The level of paranoia the girls experienced after that night is almost impossible to describe. They became prisoners in their own home. Every time they walked past a dark hallway, they felt angry eyes burning into the back of their necks. When they took a shower, they kept the curtain partially open, terrified of what might be standing on the other side of the frosted glass waiting for them. They stopped trying to communicate with the house entirely. They stopped knocking on the walls. They tried desperately to ignore the scratching sounds and the heavy, raspy breathing that bled through the plaster at night, hoping and praying that if they just did not give it any attention, it would eventually get bored and go away. They tried to tell Frank about the Ouija board session, but how do you tell your exhausted, grieving father that a demon is talking to you through a piece of cardboard? Frank, completely overwhelmed with the burden of keeping the family afloat, just looked at them with tired, sad eyes. He told them to throw the board away, blaming the entire terrifying experience on their overactive imaginations and the trauma of losing their mother. He promised them again that the house was safe and secure. But whatever was in the house with them did not want to be ignored anymore. It was feeding on their fear, and it was growing bolder by the day. Because right after that terrifying night with the Ouija board, the entity in the house decided it was completely done playing games in the dark. It decided to step out of the shadows, cross the boundary of the walls, and physically invade their space in broad daylight. The entity in the house decided it was completely done playing games in the dark. Up until this point, the girls could almost convince themselves that the subtle noises and minor misplaced items were just the traumatic side effects of their intense grief. But what started happening next was completely undeniable. The haunting stopped being a subtle presence in the walls and became an overwhelming, aggressive physical invasion in broad daylight. Tina and Kari would come home from high school in the mid-afternoon with the sun still shining brightly outside, and they would be completely terrified to even turn the key in their own front door. And for very good reason, they would cautiously step inside, walk into the kitchen, and immediately realize that the house had been disturbed while they were gone. Large amounts of food would be completely missing. Half a loaf of bread, leftover dinners wrapped in foil, or a previously sealed gallon of milk would be left sitting out on the kitchen counter, completely empty. At first, they desperately tried to rationalize it. They thought maybe Frank had stopped by the house during his lunch break to grab a bite to eat. But when they asked him about it later that evening, he swore up and down he had been at his job site all day long. Then the messages started appearing. The girls would walk cautiously up the stairs to their bedrooms and find small, torn pieces of lined notebook paper resting perfectly in the exact center of their pillows. Scrawled across the paper in a jagged, erratic, and deeply aggressive handwriting that looked completely unnatural were short, terrifying phrases. The notes said things like, "I am watching you," and "I know when you sleep." Sometimes the ink on the paper would still look fresh and slightly smudged. The girls were absolutely paralyzed with fear. They would just stand in the doorway of their own bedrooms, staring at the pieces of paper from a distance, quietly sobbing, entirely refusing to step foot inside the room. The sheer scale of the disturbances began to escalate to a point that completely defied any logical explanation. One afternoon, the girls returned home from school, pushed open the heavy front door, and immediately felt that the house was incredibly wrong. The silent side was heavy and suffocating. They slowly walked from the entryway toward the dining room, and as soon as they turned the corner, both of them stopped dead in their tracks and let out a blood-curdling scream. Every single heavy wooden chair in the dining room had been pulled away from the table. But they were not just pushed to the side, they had been physically lifted and stacked on top of the dining room table in a bizarre, unnatural, gravity-defying tower. It looked like some sort of sick, twisted monument built by a completely deranged mind. The girls turned around, ran completely out of the house, stood in the freezing snow on the front lawn without their winter coats, and refused to go back inside until their father got home. When Frank finally pulled his truck into the driveway, after another long, exhausting shift, he found his daughters absolutely hysterical, shaking from both the freezing cold and pure terror. They dragged him inside the house and pointed to the chaotic scene in the dining room. They showed him the terrifying scrawled notes left on their beds. They showed him the empty food containers on the kitchen counter. Frank stared at the impossible tower of chairs on his dining room table, and for the very first time since all of this started, the heavy veil of practical denial he had been wearing completely dropped. He could no longer blame this on grief. He could no longer blame it on old pipes, bad wiring, or settling foundations. Ghosts and overactive imaginations do not drink a gallon of milk, write physical notes on torn paper, and stack heavy wooden furniture. Frank immediately shifted into a fierce protective father mode. He told the girls to stay right there in the middle of the living room, grabbed a heavy metal flashlight from a kitchen drawer, and began a systematic, furious search of the entire property. He checked the deadbolt on the heavy wooden front door. It was completely locked from the inside. He marched to the back door in the kitchen. The metal chain lock was still perfectly engaged from the inside. He went from room to room, checking every single window on the first and second floors. Every single metal latch was firmly locked. The heavy winter frost built up on the wooden window frames was completely undisturbed. He even went outside and walked the entire perimeter of the house in the freezing cold. The thick blanket of snow directly beneath the first floor windows was perfectly smooth. There were zero footprints. There was no broken glass. There were absolutely no signs of forced entry anywhere on the property. Frank walked back into the living room, his face incredibly pale and his large calloused hands shaking slightly. He looked at his daughters, who were huddled together on the couch, wrapped tightly in blankets, looking up at him with desperate tear-filled eyes. Frank had just physically confirmed that absolutely no one had broken into their home. The house was a fortress, sealed tight from the inside out. And this is where the psychological blind spot reached its absolute peak. Because Frank knew the house was entirely secure, and because he knew human beings cannot magically walk through solid walls, his logical, pragmatic mind was forced to accept the impossible. He looked at the stacked chairs, looked at the locked doors, and finally believed his daughters. He believed that they were dealing with something completely supernatural, something deeply demonic. The three of them huddled together in the living room that night, terrified of the shadows in their own home, entirely convinced they were fighting a violent ghost. They had absolutely no idea that the real monster was entirely flesh and blood, and at that very moment, he was sitting just a few feet away from them, hidden in the dark, narrow void behind the living room wall, smiling in the pitch black as he listened to them cry. The escalation reached its terrifying absolute climax just a few days later. Up until this point, the entity had been playing psychological games, trying to terrify them with moving furniture, missing food, and cryptic notes. But the time for games was officially over. It was time for a physical confrontation. Frank had finally managed to convince himself that they were dealing with a ghost, but he still had to work. The bills still needed to be paid, so very reluctantly he left the girls at home while he went to work another long shift. Tina and Kari, absolutely paralyzed with fear, spent the entire day huddled in the living room, with the television volume turned all the way up to drown out any potential noises from the walls. They refused to go upstairs. They refused to even look at the walls as the sun began to set, casting long dark shadows across the living room. The power in the house suddenly flickered. The television screen cut to black, and the entire house was plunged into silence. Then, from the floor directly above them, they heard it. The sound they had been dreading, a heavy, deliberate footstep. The floorboards creaked loudly. Someone or something was walking around upstairs. Tina, her heart pounding frantically, grabbed her sister's hand. They held their breath, listening intently. The footsteps were slow, purposeful, and incredibly heavy. They moved from the hallway toward the master bedroom. Then they heard a horrific crashing sound. It sounded like a massive piece of furniture being forcefully overturned. Glass shattered. The girls screamed, covering their ears. Frank pulled into the driveway at that exact moment. He saw his daughter sprinting out the front door, slipping on the icy porch, screaming that the entity was destroying the upstairs. Frank grabbed a heavy tire iron from the back of his truck and sprinted inside. He bounded up the stairs, taking them two at a time, his anger finally overriding his fear. He was determined to confront whatever was terrorizing his family, be it a ghost or a demon. He burst into his bedroom, his grip tight on the tire iron. The room was utterly destroyed. His dresser was overturned, clothes were strewn everywhere, and the mirror on the wall was completely shattered. But what truly stopped Frank dead in his tracks was the message written on the wall. In thick, dark red liquid, smeared aggressively across the pale wallpaper, were the words, "I'm in your room. Come find me." Frank's blood ran cold. He backed out of the room, his eyes scanning the dark hallway. He checked the girls' bedrooms. They were empty. The bathroom was empty. The entire second floor appeared to be deserted, save for the horrifying message. He stood in the middle of the hallway, gripping the tire iron, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Then, from the dark, narrow closet at the end of the hallway, he heard a sound. A very distinct physical sound. The closet door slowly creaked open. Frank slowly walked toward it, his heart hammering against his ribs. He gripped the tire iron tightly, ready to swing. He peered into the darkness of the closet, expecting to see a ghost, a demon, or an empty room. But what he saw was far more terrifying than anything he could have ever imagined. Stepping out from the shadows of the closet, clutching a small hatchet, was a young teenage boy. His face was covered in bizarre tribalistic paint. He looked disheveled, dirty, and entirely unhinged. But the most horrifying detail, the thing that made Frank's stomach violently churn, was what the boy was wearing. He was wearing Frank's deceased wife's favorite dress. This was no ghost. This was a flesh and blood human being who had been living inside their walls, listening to their every word, and feeding on their terror. The confrontation that followed would rip the thin veil of their reality to shreds, revealing a truth far more disturbing than any supernatural haunting. Time stopped in that narrow, dimly lit hallway. Frank Bowen stood completely frozen, his large, calloused hands gripping the heavy metal tire iron so tightly, his knuckles turned entirely white. The adrenaline that had been surging through his veins just seconds earlier, the righteous anger of a father ready to violently banish a demon from his home, evaporated instantly. It was replaced by a wave of pure paralyzing nausea. Because standing right in front of him, stepping out of the dark shadows of the hallway closet, was not a translucent spirit. It was not a poltergeist. It was a living, breathing teenage boy. But it was not just the shocking presence of a stranger in his secure house that made Frank's stomach violently churn. It was the grotesque, deeply twisted way the boy presented himself. The teenager face was smeared with dark, erratic streaks of war paint. In his right hand, he loosely gripped a small, sharp hatchet. And draped over his thin, scrawny frame, hanging awkwardly off his shoulders, was a floral summer dress. Frank instantly recognized that dress. It was his deceased wife's absolute favorite dress, the one she used to wear on Sunday afternoons. The psychological cruelty of this visual was absolutely staggering. This boy had not just broken into their home, he had violated their most sacred, painful memories. For 3 agonizing seconds, neither of them moved. The boy just stood there in the doorway of the closet, staring back at Frank with wide, unblinking, entirely dead eyes. He did not look terrified of the large, angry man holding a weapon. He looked entirely calm, almost amused. He tilted his head slightly to the side, a slow, sickening smile spreading across his painted face, and let out a soft, raspy breath. It was the exact same heavy, congested breathing that Tina had been hearing through her bedroom wall for weeks. That sound completely snapped Frank out of his stunned paralysis. A primal, fiercely protective rage exploded inside him. He let out a furious yell, raised the heavy metal tire iron high above his head, and charged directly at the closet, fully intending to violently end the nightmare right then and there. But the teenage boy did not charge back. He did not even raise the hatchet to defend himself. Instead, he did something completely unexpected. He quickly scrambled backward, retreating deep into the dark closet. Frank lunged forward, throwing his entire body weight against the wooden doorframe, tearing violently through the thick winter coats and heavy boxes stored inside, expecting to corner the boy against the back wall. But his hands just hit empty space. The boy was completely gone. Frank frantically waved his arms in the pitch black of the closet, his breathing heavy and ragged. He fumbled for the small pull-string light bulb hanging overhead and yanked it on. A harsh yellow light flooded the tiny space. Frank stared at the back wall of the closet, and suddenly the entire horrifying mystery of the last several months crashed down on him with devastating clarity. The back wall of the closet was not solid plaster. A large rectangular section of the wooden baseboard and drywall had been carefully, meticulously cut away, creating a dark, jagged hole just barely wide enough for a human body to squeeze through. Frank slowly dropped to his knees, ignoring the sharp pain in his joints, and shined his flashlight directly into the hole. The beam of light cut through the thick dust and illuminated a narrow, unfinished crawl space hidden entirely behind the architecture of the house. It was a secret pitch-black tunnel system that ran parallel to the hallways, connecting the bedrooms, plunging down behind the living room walls, and completely wrapping around the structural frame of the entire home. As Frank stared into that dark void, a cold sweat broke out across his entire body. The moving keys, the disappearing food, the channel changing on the television, the rhythmic tapping responding to his daughters in the dead of night. The heavy footsteps, it was never a ghost. It was never the spirit of his dead wife trying to communicate with her grieving children. It was a deeply disturbed, violent intruder who had physically moved into the dark, hollow spaces of their home. He had been crawling right beside them, separated by a mere half-inch of painted drywall. When the girls were crying themselves to sleep, missing their mother, he was sitting right there in the dark, listening to them. And worst of all, Frank realized that because this hidden network of crawl spaces connected to every single room in the house, the boy with the hatchet was not trapped. He was completely loose inside the walls right at that very moment. He could pop out of any vent, any closet, or any ceiling hatch at any given second. The house was his playground, and they were the prey. Frank did not hesitate for another second. He scrambled backward out of the closet, slammed the door shut, and sprinted down the hallway. He bounded down the stairs, practically throwing himself into the living room, where Tina and Kari were huddled together, screaming and crying. He did not explain anything. He just grabbed both of his daughters by their arms, forcefully dragged them out the front door into the freezing, blinding winter snow and ran. They did not stop running until they reached the neighbor house across the street. Frank pounded frantically on the door until the confused neighbor opened it, immediately pushing his daughters inside to safety. He grabbed the phone off the kitchen wall, his hands shaking so violently he could barely dial the numbers, and called the police, screaming that there was an armed man living inside the walls of his house. The terrifying game of hide and seek was finally over, but the full, horrific truth of who that boy was, and exactly how long he had been living in the dark, was about to be dragged out into the light. Within minutes, the flashing red and blue lights of multiple police cruisers violently tore through the quiet, snowy streets of Pepperell, casting erratic shadows across the front of the Bowen house. Frank was standing in his neighbor's driveway, physically shielding his two freezing, terrified daughters wrapped in borrowed blankets. When the first officers stepped out of their vehicles, hands resting cautiously on their service weapons, Frank ran up to them. He was talking incredibly fast, practically hyperventilating, trying to explain that there was a boy armed with a hatchet, wearing his dead wife's dress, currently running loose inside the walls of his home. At first, the officers looked at Frank with a heavy dose of skepticism. The story sounded completely absurd, like the plot of a cheap slasher film. But as they looked at the sheer, unadulterated terror in the eyes of Tina and Kari, who were sobbing uncontrollably and shaking like leaves in the freezing wind, their demeanor instantly changed. They knew immediately that whatever was inside that house, this family genuinely believed it was lethal. The officers drew their weapons, grabbed their heavy-duty tactical flashlights, and approached the front door. The transition from a quiet, grieving suburban home to an active, highly dangerous crime scene was instant. They kicked the heavy wooden front door completely open, loudly announcing their presence, their voices echoing off the empty walls of the living room. Silence answered them. The house was dead quiet. Moving in a tight, methodical formation, the officers began to clear the first floor. They swept the kitchen, the living room, and the dining room, checking under tables and behind doors. They found the bizarre, impossible tower of wooden chairs stacked on the dining room table, exactly as the girls had described it. They found the half-eaten food on the counters, but there was no sign of the intruder. They slowly made their way up the wooden staircase, the old steps creaking loudly under the weight of their heavy boots. When they reached the second-floor hallway, the beam of their flashlights immediately caught the horrific scene in the master bedroom. They saw the overturned furniture, the shattered mirror glass covering the floor, and the terrifying message smeared aggressively across the wallpaper in dark red fluid. The officers tightened their grips on their firearms, realizing the threat was absolutely real and highly unstable. Frank had told them exactly where the boy disappeared, so the lead officer slowly approached the dark, narrow closet at the end of the hallway. He kicked the closet door open and shined his light past the hanging winter coats. Just as Frank had described, there was a jagged rectangular hole crudely cut into the drywall near the floorboards. The lead officer radioed for backup, requesting K-9 units and a full perimeter lockdown of the property. Then he got down on his hands and knees, gripped his flashlight tightly, and squeezed his head and shoulders through the jagged hole, shining his beam into the pitch-black void of the home's architecture. What the officer saw inside that crawl space was enough to make his stomach violently churn. The hidden area between the walls was incredibly narrow, uninsulated, and suffocatingly tight, filled with decades of thick dust and exposed wooden studs. But it was not empty. About 10 feet down the dark, narrow tunnel, the officer's flashlight illuminated what could only be described as a grotesque makeshift nest. The police carefully crawled into the wall to examine the space, and the sheer scale of the intruder's operation became terrifyingly clear. Spread out across the dusty wooden beams was a sleeping bag that had been stolen from the family's basement. Surrounding the sleeping bag was an absolute mountain of garbage. There were dozens of empty food wrappers, discarded soda cans, and half-eaten plates of food that had clearly been stolen directly from the Bowen kitchen while they were completely unaware. There were jars filled with human waste, proving that the boy had been living, eating, and sleeping in this suffocatingly tight space for weeks, if not months, without ever leaving the house. But the trash and the sleeping bag were not the most disturbing things the police found in that dark tunnel. As the officers shined their flashlights along the backside of the drywall, they noticed several small, deliberate modifications. At roughly eye level, For someone sitting on the floor of the crawl space, the boy had carefully scraped away tiny sections of the plaster right down to the final layer of paint. He had used a sharp tool to puncture microscopic holes completely through the wall. The officers leaned in and looked through one of these tiny improvised peepholes. The beam of their flashlight shot straight through the wall and illuminated Tina's bed. The officer's blood ran entirely cold. He crawled further down the tunnel and found another hole. This one looked directly into the girl's bathroom. Another hole looked straight down into the living room, perfectly positioned above the couch where the girls watched television. The terrifying puzzle pieces violently snapped together. This disturbed teenager had not just been hiding in the walls. He had built a comprehensive 360-degree surveillance system. Every single time the girls changed clothes, every time they cried to each other about missing their mother, every time they nervously played with the Ouija board in the dark, he was sitting just an inch away, peering through those tiny holes, watching their every single move and feeding off their absolute terror. He knew their routines, he knew their fears, he controlled their reality. The officers backed out of the crawl space, covered in thick dust and completely disgusted by what they had just found. The nest was currently empty, but the K9 units outside had not picked up any scent leaving the property. The house was entirely surrounded by police. There were no footprints in the fresh snow outside the first floor windows. The officers looked at each other, a dark, deeply unsettling realization washing over them. The boy had not escaped. He was still somewhere inside the walls, and the dark, twisted maze of the old New England house was a territory he knew far better than they ever could. The real hunt was just beginning. The realization that the armed intruder was still physically trapped inside the architecture of the house completely changed the dynamic of the police operation. This was no longer a standard break-in. It was a highly dangerous, claustrophobic game of cat and mouse against a disturbed individual who held the ultimate home court advantage. He knew every single blind spot, every dead end, and every structural weak point of the house. The police officers, on the other hand, were navigating completely blind. The lead investigator called an additional backup, instructing them to form an absolutely impenetrable perimeter around the outside of the home. Every single window, every basement hatch, and every door was covered by officers with their weapons drawn. Nobody was getting out. Then a specialized tactical team was sent inside with heavy tools, axes, and crowbars. Their orders were simple. If they had to dismantle the entire house piece by piece to find him, they would. For the next 2 hours, the Bowen house was subjected to a systematic, violent deconstruction. The sounds of heavy sledgehammers smashing through plaster and crowbars, tearing away thick wooden baseboards, echoed out into the freezing suburban street. The officers crawled through the suffocatingly tight, dust-filled crawl spaces, shining their flashlights into the endless, dark voids between the floors, coughing uncontrollably as decades of insulation filled their lungs. They checked the attic, tearing up floorboards. They checked the basement, smashing through drywall. But the boy was like a ghost. He kept slipping through the internal maze, staying just one step ahead of the search teams. But eventually, the physical space inside the walls began to run out. The officers were slowly backing him into a corner. Down in the damp, freezing basement of the house, 2 officers were carefully inspecting a section of wooden paneling near the old water heater. Something about this specific wall looked slightly wrong. The seams where the wood met the concrete floor did not sit perfectly flush, and there was a very faint scuff mark on the dust-covered ground directly beneath it, as if the panel had been repeatedly pushed open and dragged shut. One of the officers raised his heavy metal flashlight and slammed the butt of it hard against the wooden panel. It did not make a solid, dull thud. It echoed with a hollow, empty sound. The officer signaled to his partner, unholstered his service weapon, and kicked the wooden panel with the bottom of his heavy boot. The wood splintered and caved inward, revealing another, even smaller pitch-black cavity hidden behind the basement wall. The officer dropped to his knees and shined his incredibly bright flashlight directly into the dark hole. And right there, huddled completely into a tight ball, trembling violently in the harsh glare of the light, was the boy. He was still wearing the dead mother's favorite floral dress, now completely covered in thick gray dust and cobwebs. The terrifying, jagged war paint on his face was smeared with sweat and dirt. He was clutching the small, sharp hatchet tightly to his chest, his knuckles completely white. But in that harsh, unforgiving police spotlight, the terrifying illusion he had built completely collapsed. He did not look like a demon anymore. He did not look like a supernatural monster. He just looked like a pathetic, cornered, deeply disturbed teenager. The officers immediately drew their weapons and screamed at him to drop the hatchet and show his hands. For one agonizing, incredibly tense second, the boy just stared blindly into the light, his grip on the weapon tightening. The officers genuinely thought they were going to have to shoot him right there in the wall. But then the absolute reality of the situation seemed to finally crash down on him. The dark fantasy he had been living in was over. He slowly uncurled his fingers, letting the hatchet drop to the dusty wooden floor with a heavy thud, and raised his empty, shaking hands into the air. The police forcefully dragged him out of the wall, slammed him against the cold concrete of the basement, and locked heavy metal handcuffs tightly around his wrists. As they marched him up the stairs, through the violently destroyed living room, and out the front door into the flashing red and blue lights, Frank, Tina, and Carrie watched from the safety of the neighbor yard. When Tina saw the boy face illuminated by the police cruisers, her heart stopped completely. The absolute terror of the situation gave way to a sickening, gut-wrenching shock. Because she recognized him, his name was Daniel LaPlante. He was a 16-year-old kid who lived right in their very own neighborhood. He was not some random faceless drifter. Just a few months prior, before all of the horrifying events began, Daniel had somehow gotten Tina's phone number and had called her, awkwardly asking her out on a date. Tina, feeling completely uncomfortable with his strange, intense demeanor and dealing with the overwhelming grief of losing her mother, had politely rejected him. A normal, well-adjusted teenager would have been completely crushed for a few days, maybe listened to some sad music, and eventually moved on. But Daniel LaPlante was not normal. His mind was incredibly dark, deeply fractured, and violently obsessive. When Tina rejected him, he did not just walk away, he became entirely consumed by her. He stalked her house, studied the architecture, and when the family left for a funeral or grocery run, he found an unlocked window and slipped inside. He found the hidden access panel to the crawl spaces, crawled into the pitch-black void, and simply decided to never leave. He had been living right beside her for months. He had listened to her cry, he had watched her sleep, he had manipulated her grief, posing as her dead mother through the Ouija board entirely for his own sick, twisted entertainment. The monster was not a demon from hell. It was the quiet, strange 16-year-old boy from down the street, and he had been there the entire time. The arrest of Daniel LaPlante brought an immediate end to the physical danger, but the psychological damage he inflicted on the Bowen family was absolute and permanent. Just try to put yourself in their shoes for a second. Your home is supposed to be your ultimate sanctuary. It is the one place on earth where you can lock the heavy deadbolts, shut the blinds against the outside world, and allow yourself to be completely vulnerable. For Tina and Kari, who were already navigating the devastating, crushing trauma of losing their mother, that sanctuary was completely violated in the most horrific, intimate way imaginable. Every single time they had cried out for their mom, in the dark, desperately seeking comfort, Daniel had been sitting just a few inches away, pressing his ear against the cold plaster, soaking it all in. When they used the Ouija board, terrified and hoping for a message from the afterlife, he was the one violently shifting his weight in the walls to scare them, feeding their panic. When they were fast asleep, completely defenseless, he was silently pushing open the hidden panels, stepping into their bedroom, and standing directly over their beds, watching their chests rise and fall in the pitch black. The comforting ghost they thought they had found was actually a flesh and blood predator meticulously studying his prey. Unsurprisingly, Frank Bowen packed up whatever belongings the family had left and moved his daughters out of that house almost immediately. They could never spend another night under that roof. The walls, the ceilings, the closets, everything that was originally built to protect them had been turned into a weapon against them. They were constantly terrified that every settling pipe, every gust of wind rattling the window, or every creaking floorboard was someone else crawling through the dark, suffocating voids of the architecture. The trauma of knowing you were never actually alone in your most private moments is a scar that simply does not heal. Daniel LaPlante was taken into police custody and sent to a juvenile detention facility for his crimes against the Bowen family. Tragically, the justice system completely failed to recognize just how deeply evil and fundamentally dangerous he truly was. A short time after his release, his dark obsessions would escalate into unthinkable, horrific violence, leading him to commit a string of brutal murders in another neighborhood that would ultimately land him in a maximum security prison for the rest of his natural life. But the story of what he did inside the walls of that old Massachusetts house remains one of the most chilling, deeply disturbing examples of real-world horror ever recorded. When we hear a strange bump in the night, our minds instinctively jump to the supernatural, because, in a strange, twisted way, ghosts are almost easier to deal with. A ghost cannot physically hold a sharp hatchet, a ghost cannot drink your milk, write you threatening letters on torn notebook paper, or wear your dead mother's favorite dress to mock your grief. The reality that a living, breathing human being can quietly slip into the dark, forgotten spaces of your home, silently coexisting with you for months without you ever knowing, is a truth that is almost entirely too terrifying for the human brain to process. We confidently tell ourselves that as long as the front doors are locked and the windows are shut, we are perfectly safe. We completely forget that the walls themselves are hollow. So I have to ask you, when you turn off the lights, pull the heavy blankets up to your chin, and go to bed tonight, what are you going to do if you hear a faint, subtle scratching sound coming from the drywall right next to your pillow? Or are you going to just roll over, close your eyes, and tell yourself it is just the old house settling in the wind? Or are you going to get out of bed, grab a flashlight, and check the back of your closet? Let me know exactly what you think you would have done if you were in the Bowen family's situation down in the comments below. Thank you so much for listening. Good night.